Welcome to the Still Curtain podcast. It is Saturday, January 11th, and the Pittsburgh Steelers have been eliminated from the wild card round of the NFL playoffs by the Baltimore Ravens. It looks like the final. We're not even final yet. We're going on a little early for this instant reaction show. It looks like the final is going to be 28-14. I'm Josh Yourish, and we're going to get into all of it here on the Still Curtain podcast. Send your questions, send your comments. Should the Steelers hang on to Mike Tomlin and run this back another year? Should Russell Wilson come back? What's wrong with this defense? Send everything. We'll try to get to as many questions and comments and everything as we can. Breaking down this season, what feels like a lost season after such a good start, a complete and total meltdown capped off by another abysmal playoff performance from the Steelers under Mike Tomlin. It has now been 8 years since the Pittsburgh Steelers have won a playoff game. In that stretch, they are 0-5 now. And this is, it was a bad one. It's bad because it's to the Ravens. It's bad because of how it looked in the first half. It's going to end up being likely 28-14, right? The Steelers are still calling their timeouts, but this thing is finished, and it was finished at halftime. So the Steelers' last 4 playoff games, and now we're going to include the Ravens one in this. And Austin Bechtold, my friend over at 93.7 The Fan, who does a great job on the radio station, posted a graphic of the Steelers' last 4 playoff games. So 2017 against the Jacksonville Jaguars, that one at home after the Steelers coming off a bye, they fell behind 21-0. 2020, the COVID year that started off so great, hosting the Cleveland Browns in the wild card round, fell behind 28-0. 2021, the next year, on the road in Kansas City, trailed 35-7. And 2023 trailed 21-0. 2024 now, in the 2025 wild card round, the Steelers fell behind 21-0 in the first half. And it looks like maybe the Ravens will tack on a field goal here, but I just wanted to get the conversation going because it looks like everything is really all academic at this point. It's a finished product, and they just flashed the rushing yards for the Ravens. They're at 299 rushing yards as they're letting the clock tick down in this one. Derrick Henry ran all over the Steelers. Lamar Jackson ran all over the Steelers. The Steelers looked completely unprepared. Pittsburgh Will in the chat says fire Tomlin right there on the spot. Don't let him return as a Steeler in any capacity. If he's getting fired, I can't imagine he'd return in any other capacity, but I agree. And that's ultimately what we're going to get to, right? We're going to break down how the defense looked so abysmal in this spot, how the defense has continually looked so abysmal in the playoffs under Mike Tomlin. It's such a recurring theme, and you can point to the problems at quarterback, because I don't think the Steelers have the answer with Russell Wilson. They clearly didn't have the answer with Kenny Pickett. Once Ben injured his elbow, everything was kind of shot from that point on. So, yeah, he's been able to manufacture winning seasons with really poor quarterback situations. But when you get into the playoffs with the most expensive defense in the NFL, one of the most talented defenses in the NFL, and routinely get bullied schematically, physically, something has to change. And you can't fire the whole team. So eventually you got to fire the coach. And I'm not even advocating, I say fire there as more of a proxy word for what they should really do, because the Steelers should trade Mike Tomlin. That everyone always says when you're talking about potentially moving on from Mike Tomlin, if you fired him, he'd be hired in a second. Well, then don't fire him. You signed him to a contract extension this offseason, Steel 43. This was so pathetic. Absolutely it was. You sign Mike Tomlin to a contract extension this offseason. Trade him. I'm sure Jacksonville would be thrilled to have Mike Tomlin. I'm sure Chicago would be thrilled to have Mike Tomlin. There are so many teams in the NFL that would be thrilled to have consistent winning seasons. But these playoff disasters, they fall on one guy. They fall on Mike Tomlin. He is a defensive coach, a defensive-minded head coach with the most expensive defense in the NFL, and you get completely run off the field with poor effort, a terrible scheme, terrible game planning, and waxed by your division rival, who you were leading in the division for much of the year, in the playoffs on a national stage. It's embarrassing, and it's completely expected now. This is what happens every single time the Steelers squeak into the playoffs since that 2017 year when the same thing happened, but the Steelers actually felt like a contender that year. The Steelers have never felt like a team that could win even one playoff game, let alone 2, 3, 4. And that has to reflect on Mike Tomlin. William in the chat, no game plan to stop the run. What a joke. Complete agreement. The Steelers gave up 308 yards in the first half. The most expensive defense in the NFL with a defensive-minded head coach gave up 308 yards in the first half. This Baltimore offense is fantastic. Lamar Jackson's probably going to win his 4th MVP. Well-deserved. And before we dig into a little more of the numbers, I'm glad to see Lamar Jackson just absolutely torch the Steelers, because all the Steelers fans that talk about how overrated Lamar is because of a couple bad games against the Steelers, and then he's injured practically every time they play him, that's just ridiculous. That narrative in Pittsburgh has to stop. So in that respect, I'm glad he did this so we can accept there's a monster in our division. We have to rise to that level. The Steelers have to aggressively rebuild this roster and aggressively attack the quarterback position, because it's the only way you're going to be able to contend with these teams. But before you can even start that process of trying to elevate yourself to the level of the Baltimore Ravens, to the level of the Buffalo Bills, to the level of the Kansas City Chiefs, hell, to the level of the Cincinnati Bengals when they figure out their defense because they have Joe Burrow, you have to move on from the head coach. You absolutely have to. Pittsburgh will. The dismal era has to end now. It could be years before we ever get to another Super Bowl. I feel bad for older members of Steeler Nation, another wasted season. I do too. At least I'm 23 years old. I have lots of seasons ahead of me, right? I have memories of Super Bowls, and I know there's a lot of years left. Just being stuck in this purgatory, even for me, is infuriating. I can imagine how it feels for older Steelers fans and older Steelers players. How do you think Cam Hayward feels? He's going to be a Hall of Famer. He was an All-Pro again this year, playing incredible football well into his 30s, well beyond when an interior defensive lineman like that should play. He's the model Steeler. He's been incredible for his entire career here. And nothing. He's going to have no hardware to show for it. TJ Watt, getting a little long in the tooth, wasn't an All-Pro. Had a really underwhelming season for his standard. I can't imagine a world where TJ Watt wins a Super Bowl as a Pittsburgh Steeler, right? There's no avenue out of this for them with the current infrastructure that they have. And I have talked all year about how maybe the avenue is great drafting along the line of scrimmage, right? You build through the trenches, you get offensive linemen, and I will hear like the offense had problems. They were starting Calvin Anderson came in. Spencer Anderson started tonight. They're down to a skeleton crew along the offensive line. There were never many receivers on this team. Like, I will hear those excuses. The defense, Mike Tomlin's defense, if no other move is made, if they do not move on from Mike Tomlin, the Steelers at least have to move on from Terrell Austin. Not that the defensive coordinator in Pittsburgh is the one actually running the defense. We know it's Mike Tomlin, but at least try to get some new ideas. At least try to save face after that performance. It's absolutely, utterly abysmal. And I mean, the Steelers will go back to the very start. The Steelers win the toss and receive. It's utter desperation from a coach who knows he's about to get waxed. Nothing about this Steelers offense has inspired you to say, let's take the ball first. It's not aggressiveness, it's desperation. And it's absolutely ridiculous game planning from Mike Tomlin. And there were even bad decisions in a game that never should have been close. So the dominance of the Baltimore Ravens offense in this one, their second touchdown drive after, right, the Steelers take the ball, they punt, Ravens march right down the field for a touchdown. The second Ravens touchdown drive, 13 plays, 85 yards, all runs, touchdown. One of them was a scramble, so not all called runs, but all runs. And they had this on the Amazon halftime broadcast, which I don't love the Amazon booth, but their halftime is actually excellent. And that's the first time that's happened in an NFL game since 2006. That's the last time a 13-play, 85-yard, all-run touchdown drive happened. A touchdown drive of that length with all runs. And it's there's a noticeable lack of effort, right? Terrible game planning. Their idea that, okay, for years and years, it's all about keeping Lamar in the pocket, not letting him run. That's our game plan, right? Rush lane integrity. That's how we slow this guy down. Now we're going to throw a curveball. Zone read, TJ Watt, hit the running back. Go downhill, hit the running back. Don't worry about Lamar. Eventually, you got to adjust. This is the best rushing quarterback of all time. And your game plan was to just let him have it. Just run wild, Lamar. It was utterly, utterly baffling. The 308 yards that the Ravens gained in the first half, the most in a playoff game since 2019 against any team. And in the first half, the Ravens had 19 first downs to 2 from the Steelers. And in the second half, right, Russell Wilson came out gunning, came out throwing downfield, and you punch back a little bit. But I'm fully convinced that none of that happens unless your back is against the wall the way that it was after such a terrible start. Desperation is the only thing that jump-started this offense. And it's the same thing we've seen in all of these playoff losses for years and years and years. And Big Cuz 410, I'll acknowledge you in the chat, right? A Ravens fan, clearly. 186 for the King. Derrick Henry was unstoppable for the Steelers tonight. And there's nothing that Mike Tomlin did to counter the Baltimore run game. If you're spending as much money as the Steelers are on defense, your offense is going to have deficiencies. You're going to have to win with that defense. And they're not even coming remotely close to doing that in any big game against any quality opponent, right? The Steelers ended the year with a gauntlet. We knew that was the case. We knew the Steelers were going to have to rack up wins early in the season. And to their credit, they did. But after the win, 27-14 over the Browns, a 27-13 loss to the Eagles, a 34-17 loss to the Ravens, a 29-10 loss to the Chiefs, and a 19-17 loss to the Cincinnati Bengals with arguably the worst defense in the entire NFL. And then this performance. It would get every other coach in the NFL fired. That type of collapse on the heels of last season with wild quarterback mismanagement, the inability to develop your first round quarterback. I don't think there was anything there to develop, but the identification first of that quarterback, then the lack of development of that player, the hires that Tomlin's made at offensive coordinator. No organization, no franchise in the NFL would give their head coach this much of a leash. And just as I had absolutely no faith coming into today, right? A Steelers playoff game, even in a down year, even last year, with Mason Rudolph starting the game, I was able to start to talk myself into the idea of maybe Josh Allen turns the ball over a couple of times. Maybe they get the Bills. Maybe the Steelers can win a playoff game, right? I could talk myself into the smallest bit of that last year because I want to, because I love this team. I've rooted for this team my entire life. Today never felt like a playoff game. There was no hope. There was no excitement. There was no feeling of this team belongs here and this team has a chance to win. And just a few weeks ago, after the Steelers, beat teams like Washington and beat teams like Baltimore, it felt like the Steelers could actually make a run with Russell Wilson, make a run with this defense. And it completely collapsed and fell apart every time you played a credible opponent. It's the worst possible place that you can be in the NFL. And there was no excitement in this game, no belief. And that belief, that lack of belief, if you will, that I had, the Steelers players clearly had that too. There were clips going around about Dante Jackson and his effort or lack thereof on tackles in the second half, and plenty of players. It's not just to call out Dante Jackson, who fittingly or ironically was traded for Deontay Johnson, who last year gave lackluster effort down the stretch. This is a trend with Mike Tomlin teams. There is this narrative that is now inexplicable to me of, well, he may not always have the best team, but Mike Tomlin teams are going to play to the competition. They're going to go out there and they're going to fight. There was absolutely no fight from the Pittsburgh Steelers tonight in this matchup from the kickoff. If Mike Tomlin, the ultimate culture setter, right? He's not the scheme lord that defensively, I guess Jesse Minter for the Chargers is getting this kind of publicity and that kind of name. Mike McDonald with the Seahawks, who was with the Ravens, that Harbaugh defensive tree now, which is weird to say. Or even Brian Flores in Minnesota. He's not that type of coach. He's never been that type of coach. So you need to fight. Your team needs to play hard. If you're the culture guy, you need to not have players like George Pickens giving lackluster effort and getting in fights with fans and constant personal foul penalties throughout the season. You need to not have those players be such a problem, because that is your virtue. That is your calling card, is culture and effort and toughness and physicality. And the Steelers showed none of those things against the Ravens. It's embarrassing. And if I was Mike Tomlin, right, I mean, I would love the job security and the multi-million-dollar paycheck, but I would be ready for something new. I talked about this last week on the show, right? Theo Epstein, general manager that saved the Red Sox and then saved the Cubs, talks about how 10 years in one place, once you get over that, it starts to get stale. And that's not, true everywhere. John Harbaugh's been doing this since 2008 in Baltimore, and that team looks poised to potentially compete for another Super Bowl. But sometimes it gets stale. That's not to say that Mike Tomlin isn't a great coach, that Mike Tomlin doesn't someday deserve to have a gold jacket and a bust in Canton. It's stale. It's been stale for a really long time. I'm done with it. I gotta imagine he's sick of it. We all are. Anthony in the chat, time to move on from Tomlin. I'd love to hear from anyone if you think Tomlin should stay and what your reasoning is. If you think Tomlin should go, I'd love to hear it in the chat. Any questions, comments, things you want me to talk about, essay prompts, go ahead. I want to interact with you guys tonight. I want to know where Steelers fans are at, where everyone's heads are at, because I'm at a point of apathy bordering on insanity, I think. I'm becoming apathetic about the results of these games because I know there's no chance of actually contending for something meaningful. And the fact that I feel that way enrages me. It's the worst place. Apathy is the worst thing for an organization. And the Steelers are going to get there. If they continue to do the same thing, if they continue to subject us to season after season of 10 wins and no playoff success under Mike Tomlin, I will. This is not just reactionary meltdown to a disastrous result, right? Because these instant reaction shows can be hard for me because distance allows you to be more rational. Obviously, emotion is inherent in an instant reaction. It's your reaction. Emotion is very inherent. So it's hard for me to sometimes separate that. But in this case, I think it's good. I think the emotion is warranted because this is where the Steelers have driven me and driven a lot of Steelers fans to this point of total frustration where everyone, it feels like the overwhelming majority of people are ready to move on from Mike Tomlin. And I absolutely am too. And I'll make sure to keep that energy going into next year, because if you had to, force me to make a prediction, Mike Tomlin is coming back. Mike Tomlin is absolutely going to come back next season. He's absolutely going to be the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's just not the way they do business. The Steelers just aren't going to move on from a head coach like this. They fetishize stability over success. And I don't expect there to be any changes on that front. There are going to be changes, though. And maybe this is a good time, 23 minutes in, for me to talk about something other than the head coach of the team. We could talk about the quarterback. Russell Wilson, it's complicated with Russell Wilson. He finished 20 for 29 for 270 and 2 touchdowns. That looks like a really great stat line. And it is a highly efficient stat line. A lot of it came on desperation deep balls once you're already in a huge deficit trying to dig yourself out. That's just going to be the nature of play calling, right? And clearly the Steelers should have been more aggressive with their play calling earlier, right? Tomlin loves to act aggressive taking the ball when he wins the coin toss, but the aggressiveness does not translate to action, to play calling, right? Everyone must not have got the message of aggressiveness because Arthur Smith was not calling the game that way. So Russell Wilson ends up with a good stat line. I don't think he was particularly good. I don't think he was the biggest problem. There are tons of issues on this offensive line, as I mentioned, right? Any team that is down to their backup left tackle and maybe their third string left tackle, if you consider Broderick Jones should have been the left tackle. Now he's at right. Fautanu's out. So you're kind of at your number 2 right tackle, your number 2 left tackle, and then your number 2 left tackle goes down. Calvin Anderson comes in. Spencer Anderson is your third string right guard behind or fourth string right guard because Nate Herbig would have been that. So ravaged by injuries, absolutely ravaged by injuries. And the failure to address the wide receiver room this offseason That is a mark against Omar Khan, who I think has been largely fantastic since taking over the role of general manager from Kevin Colbert. That one is going to be on his resume as a loss. I don't think the Steelers should have given up a first round pick to do it, because I don't think Brandon Ayuk meaningfully changes the outcome of this season. Maybe a guy like that is worth one win to this team, but there are big foundational issues that I don't think he would allow the Steelers to overcome, and a lot of those issues on the defensive side of the ball. To Russell Wilson, I'm done. I was done coming into the year. I said, coming out of Denver, having seen what I saw, Russell Wilson, I said, was no longer a functional NFL quarterback. I was clearly proven wrong in that sentiment. And I have accepted that throughout the season. I have stopped being so hard on Russ. He has exceeded the expectations I had for him, even with this meltdown, even with as bad as the offense has looked in the past 5 games. But I'm still done. I think he puts such a hard cap on not only how successful your offense can be at this point in his career, he makes such a narrow lane of what you can do. He gives you such a narrow lane through which you can succeed. He is a first read and scramble quarterback. He is the quarterback in a lot of ways, and has been throughout his career, that Steelers fans have said for a long time that Lamar Jackson is. Lamar Jackson can be a pocket passer. Saw it tonight. He ran really well tonight, but when he sits in the pocket, he can dissect teams. He's done it all season. You don't throw for over 4,000 yards and 42 touchdowns if you're not an excellent passer out of the pocket. Lamar Jackson can sit in there. He can go through his reads. He can find the open guy. Russell Wilson, primary read, scramble. That's always been in his DNA. It's the reason, with his size as well, that he was a 3rd-round pick coming out of Wisconsin. Obviously, he outperformed a 3rd-round pick. Obviously, he's going to have a chance to be a Hall of Famer. But as his athleticism diminished, he just can't overcome. He can't change that mindset, and he can't overcome his deficiencies anymore. He can't play backyard football. He gets so antsy in the pocket. He drops his eyes. His feet speed up. Kirk Herbstreit has been in a lot of hot water lately, especially with college football fans. I don't know if NFL fans are quite as aware of how fired up college football fans have been at Kirk Herbstreit lately. But I thought he was excellent tonight, talking about the lack of fight for the Steelers, the lack of effort, being one of the few analysts nationally who's willing to criticize Mike Tomlin and his team. And I think he was great on Russell Wilson. No, probably the Steelers shouldn't have gone to Justin Fields in the second half, because at that point you have to dig out of a hole, and Russell Wilson's downfield throwing ability obviously gives you the best chance to do that. But going forward as an organization, if you have to choose between those two guys who to bring back on a fairly cheap contract next year, absolutely my choice would be Justin Fields. Russell Wilson has not shown the ability, other than very short spurts, to throw over the middle of the field. He's not shown the ability to stand in the pocket and dissect a defense in the way that a veteran of his reputation should. And that's fine. That's just never been the player he is in the NFL. That's never been his archetype as a player. And that is totally okay. But I think his career as a starting quarterback is done. I think if the Steelers go into the AFC race next year, thinking they're a contender, running things back with Russell Wilson as your quarterback, you're bringing a pool noodle to a rocket launcher fight with Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow. and CJ Stroud and Justin Herbert in the conference. It's just not a viable path to contention, especially with all the resources that the Steelers have allocated on the defensive side of the football and the performances that they get because of their head coach, right? Uh, and I keep coming back to the defensive performance, even when I want to talk about Russell Wilson, because these two things, they're so married together with how you build a team. And there's some logic to the idea of like, be a very good defensive team, try to run the ball, hope Russell Wilson can hit some deep shots. I think that could be a winning formula. And it was at times a winning formula this year. But then your defense has to show something in the playoffs. And Mike Tomlin gets punked every time he gets there. Every time. It's time to move on from Mike Tomlin. As Anthony said in the chat, as so many people have said in the chat today, it's just time to move on. But that era is not going to end. And I'd be interested to see those of you hanging around late night with me in the chat for this instant reaction pod on the Still Curtain podcast. And of course, subscribe to the Still Curtain podcast here or wherever you get your podcasts. Where do you want the Steelers to go? Do you want to blow it up? Do you want to try to run it back? Do you want to take a big swing at another veteran quarterback if one's out there? Free agency with Sam Darnold? Try to swing a deal with Dallas for Dak Prescott? Maybe Aaron Rodgers is done in New York and would want to come to Pittsburgh. He made googly eyes at Mike Tomlin a couple years ago on I think it was Sunday or Monday Night Football. I think the foundation of a competitive roster is there in Pittsburgh. I think Omar Khan has done a really good job building through the trenches. And I think the offensive line is healthy, or at least healthier. That will greatly improve Arthur Smith's ability to run the ball. And that opens up his offense for whoever is playing quarterback. But it feels like it's time to clean house. You're running up against the end of the timeline. You either have to go all in my opinion, with Cam Hayward at the age that he is at, with TJ Watt at the age that he is at, and I'll be the one to say it, maybe fast approaching a cliff. TJ Watt was not an All-Pro this year. He might not be a top 5 edge rusher in the NFL anymore. Injuries do that to players. Age does that to players. He's still a highly impactful player, but he is falling off. That hurts this defense's ability to be effective. So with all of these factors and running up against that age timeline on a defense that's supposed to be the reason you're competing in the AFC, I tend to lean maybe not blow it up, but trade some veterans for some draft capital and let a new coach, a Ben Johnson, an innovative younger play caller, or even hell, I'd take Aaron Glenn from Detroit, who's another defensive culture guy. But at least he's doing interesting stuff on defense and limiting Justin Jefferson or Jordan Addison and Sam Darnold and the Vikings with a massively injured defense. Right? I would take Mike Vrabel, who is another culture CEO type and a former Steeler, who seems like he's going to New England, but maybe you could convince him with the most job security in the NFL that he'd be the guy here in Pittsburgh. That's the path I would go. And John is bigger than QB purgatory. The team is in coaching purgatory as well. Purgatory, fun word to say. I agree. Both things are true. One is much easier to get out of, though. You can get out of coaching purgatory. All you got to do is fire the guy and hire another good one. Yes, there are only so many good coaches in the NFL, but you have much more control over that process than you do of the process of acquiring a quarterback. You can't just happen to pick number one in the draft. And the draft, even at that point, is completely a crapshoot. And on top of that, we're learning in the NFL. This year has taught a great lesson to so many, evaluators, analysts, coaches in the NFL. Quarterbacks are so much a circumstance or a product of their circumstances, is how I'll put it, I guess. Kevin O'Connell is an excellent coach in Minnesota. The Minnesota Vikings have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. And it is hard to get players like Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. But that has enabled Sam Darnold, who looked like a massive bust in New York. I keep wanting to say New Jersey. In New York with the Jets, in Carolina with the Panthers, two dumpster fire organizations. And now he's with a good organization and a great head coach. And he looks like a quarterback who, he had the Vikings contending for the number one seed. And he played terribly in that game, but he had the Vikings contending for the number one seed in the NFC against Jared Goff, who was another reclamation project. You know who else is in the NFC playoffs? Baker Mayfield, another reclamation project. Good coaches, good skill players. They can do something with talented quarterbacks. I'm sure Justin Fields could succeed more than he has in Pittsburgh and more than he did in Chicago with a better organization. I'm not saying he'd be a superstar, but there's talent there. Quarterbacks can be reclaimed, reclamation projects. They can be elevated if you have the right infrastructure around them. And the Steelers do not have the coaching infrastructure in place to get them out of QB purgatory, as John said in the chat, which I think is a really great point, because we try to separate the two things, or maybe we don't try. People do separate the two things. Pro Tomlin people will say that he's been able to win despite the underwhelming cast of quarterbacks that he's been dealt in the past 6 years, 8 years, since Ben hurt his elbow, really is the line of demarcation with that. But he's also the wrong coach to get you out of that. I think Mike Tomlin could win another Super Bowl. I think Mike Tomlin is an excellent coach to take a talented roster with a ready-made quarterback and elevate it and help to figure things out culture-wise. A place like Jacksonville, a place like Chicago, I think that could happen if you believe in those quarterbacks, right? I would be more worried about it in Chicago with Caleb Williams because he's far from a finished product. But in Jacksonville, I still believe in Trevor Lawrence. I think Mike Tomlin could do a lot of good there. I don't think Mike Tomlin is the type of coach who can live with the growing pains of a young quarterback, who can empower a young quarterback, who can get you out of QB purgatory. And until the Steelers get out of QB purgatory, they're going to be stuck in NFL purgatory. And it's it's such a frustrating place to be in. I am glad that so many people are coming around to the realization of what this is, what the Mike Tomlin experience is. Because everyone from the outside, the national media, right? The national media says, oh, the Steelers have it so great. Mike Tomlin's never had a losing season. How could you not run it back every year with Mike? How could you be frustrated about Mike Tomlin? There are real problems in this organization, problems that the Steelers need to address. And the fact that they made it a game in the second half, or at least made it look like a game in the second half, is probably going to give Art Rooney an excuse not to face that reality. And that is incredibly frustrating as a fan of this organization, this franchise. In the chat, the real Planet X Hunter proved my freaking point. Tomlin gets blown out in the playoffs. Tomlin's era is over. We need a new coach. 35, 38, 42, 45, 48 points put up on him in recent playoff games. Tomlin is washed up. I don't know. I guess coaches can be washed up if their stuff is outdated, and clearly his defense is very outdated. There was so much talk going into the playoffs, and this happens every year, where everyone mentions that playoff football is so different from regular season football because you're scheming so specifically to beat your opponent instead of this is what we do every week. We're going to do what we do because we can't have a new bespoke game plan for every opponent in an 18-week, 17-game schedule. And that makes so much sense. So when you get to the playoffs and it's do or die, you only have one team to worry about right now. You can exploit their weaknesses. You can game plan specifically for that team. You get way more bespoke. And every time Mike Tomlin goes up against that, the other team knows the answers. They know how to solve his defense. Just look at the best example of this. Isn't even a playoff game. It's early in this season against the Colts when the Steelers lost to the Colts. Anthony Richardson goes out of that game. Who comes in but old Joe Flacco, who's played this defense plenty of times, dozens of times, and he knows exactly how to beat it. And in a lot of ways, he torched the Steelers that day to the point that the Colts eventually benched Anthony Richardson to go to Joe Flacco because maybe he could save their season. And that didn't work out because he's not facing Tomlin's defense every week, but it's so predictable. It happens every time the Steelers go into the playoffs. And if you're not going to be able to slow down the elite offenses in the AFC the way it's currently constructed and will be constructed for the next decade or so with all of these great quarterbacks, mostly still in their 20s, I think pretty much all still in their 20s, then you got to get a coach who can keep pace with them. You got to build a roster that can go blow for blow. You know who would have had a better chance in the playoffs? The Cincinnati Bengals. Because at least they could score with Baltimore. They can't get any stops, but offensive play callers, the offensive talent in the NFL is just too good. The rules enable these offenses to do so many things that they couldn't when Mike Tomlin first took over the Steelers. And defense, in a lot of ways, no longer wins championships. It is very helpful to have a great defense. It's helpful to have a defense that can be very flexible and multiple to game plan for different types of offenses through the playoffs. And I think Steve Spagnuolo is one of the best at that in the NFL with the Chiefs. But great quarterbacks, and this was probably always true, offenses and great quarterbacks are what more often than not win Super Bowls. And the Steelers don't have that and will not have a path to it. As John mentioned with his QB purgatory comment, the Steelers probably don't have a path to that unless they move on from Mike Tomlin. And that's what's going to make it so infuriating when they don't. When they don't move on from Mike Tomlin. Because even in these matchups, even when he knows that he is outgunned, he does not act accordingly. Right? The Steelers got to that 4th and inches situation, their third drive of the game from the 29-yard line. You're already down 7-0. You showed, you forced a punt on the last possession, but the Ravens' first possession, they shoved it down your throat the exact way they did a couple weeks ago in the regular season. You get to 4th and inches, and Tomlin is just running out the punt team as fast as he possibly can, because that's the type of football he wants to play. That doesn't win in the playoffs. You gotta be aggressive, especially when you don't match the opponent's talent. Take chances. Tomlin doesn't try to win these games. He tries to prolong the losing of them and hope that a fumble bounces his way and the Steelers somehow luck into something. That's not going to happen in the playoffs. He continually just coaches so scared in these big games and is so willing to punt the ball back to the other team. Even on the 4th and 16 at the start of the fourth quarter, I'm not sure that the Steelers should have punted there. You're not able to stop these physical run-first offenses. And no, your offense is not very good. Your quarterback is not what he once was. Even this season, he has regressed from his best self this year. But go down on your sword. Go down swinging. And Tomlin routinely turtles in those big spots, even when it was a game. And that's just so infuriating. Clock management is constantly a problem with Mike Tomlin. We saw it at the end of the first half. The Ravens ran the ball twice, got to third down. It looked like they were going to just run the clock down to halftime because they were getting the ball since Tomlin wanted to receive so he could punt first. Tomlin calls a timeout. The Ravens get a first down, march down the field, score a touchdown. He's just getting outcoached so thoroughly by a guy he's coached against for years and years and years and years. And then to add to the game management catastrophes, because I went big picture first, we can dive into this thing and dissect it a little more if we want to. 4th and 1 for the Ravens. The game feels like it's on the line at that point, right? Eventually, Baltimore did punt on that drive, I believe. Yes, eventually Baltimore did punt on that drive. It was their penultimate drive of the game. 4th and 1. And Tomlin tries to run out his subgroup while the Ravens are going up-tempo for a quarterback sneak with Mark Andrews, which they've already done twice in the game, and they did tempo both times. Tomlin tries to rush Loudermilk out there on the field. He never gets into position. They convert easily, and you get a too many men on the field penalty for it. You don't have time to sub there. You know what they're going to do. If you want to put your big bodies out there, call a timeout. Maybe make Harbaugh think about it. Make him reconsider. You know you need your timeouts in that spot. So just leave your defense out there. It was baffling how thoroughly he got outcoached in a game that he was outmatched. His team was outmatched in. So it became a blowout early. And then Wilson hit enough deep shots that they made it a game for him to get outcoached in. It was an absolute disaster and should be the nail in the coffin for Tomlin's largely massively successful career as the head coach of the Steelers, but it won't be. And that's the part that is even more disappointing coming out of this playoff loss. Tomlin loses to inferior teams, Hunter says in the chat. Absolutely he does. He also loses to better teams. He loses to lots of teams. Just not enough teams in a given year to have a losing season. And that's been enough. That's been the standard. And I think it's become very tired to say the standard is the standard. Oh, if the standard was really Super Bowls, we know the standard is the standard means nothing. Everyone knows it means nothing. Everyone knows it means win enough games so you don't have a losing season. So you keep filling up Acrisure Stadium. So the fans keep watching, keep coming, and you get a playoff game. That's good enough for the Roonies. That's the standard. And I think those jokes are tired, but they're also true. And until they act accordingly and show that they as a franchise have changed, will be more aggressive, are interested in winning and not just not losing, it's going to be hard for me to be 100% in on this team. And coming into the year, I said the pretty much, maybe not the best case scenario, but my prediction was the Steelers win 10 games, lose in the first round of the playoffs. So there we go. Got one right. For it to happen in this fashion is still incredibly infuriating. And yes, it happened with a quarterback who's over the hill, who's here on a veteran minimum contract. And maybe to get a winning season out of that is a fantastic job. Maybe there aren't many coaches in the NFL that would have gotten a winning season out of this roster. But I refuse to believe that. I think this was a pretty talented team, a very talented defense, the most expensive defense in the NFL. And I'm willing to be wrong at this point. If I'm running the Steelers, I'm willing to move on from Mike Tomlin, stop living in my fears, as Mike Tomlin always says. As an organization, the Steelers are living in their fears of life after Tomlin. If I'm running the Steelers, I'll take a swing. I'll take a chance. And you'll be such an attractive job to any head coach on the market. Such an attractive job because the Steelers don't fire head coaches. If you're Ben Johnson and you're deciding between the Raiders, who fire a head coach every second year, the Bears, who run through head coaches constantly, fire a new one right after they draft a new first-round quarterback that's not going to succeed because their infrastructure is a disaster, and then that guy's eventually going to sign with the Steelers. I'd absolutely come to Pittsburgh. You know, if you do a decent job, you have the job for 15, 20 years. The Steelers could get the best head coaching candidate out there, whoever they deem the best. So they should not live in their fears. They should not run this thing back. Big changes should be coming. But the reality is we all know they're not going to. Regardless, I will be here breaking it all down all offseason. Tommy Jagai and Shane Kubis on their Wednesday show will be here all offseason breaking it all down. They'll break down, I'm sure they'll have a season autopsy on Wednesday. So make sure you tune into that show. They do such a good job. They'll break down this game. They'll get into what to do with Russell Wilson. They already started to do it a little bit last week, as I did as well, because there was no reason to be confident that the Steelers would win this football game. The Steelers didn't win this football game. They lose to the Ravens 28-14. It's been 8 years since the Pittsburgh Steelers have won a playoff football game. 6 straight losses in the playoffs under Mike Tomlin, and likely another year of Coach T in 2025. How great does that sound? I'll be back talking to you next Monday, not this upcoming Monday, but the Monday after. Get back onto the Monday, Wednesday, Still Curtain show schedule. So make sure you subscribe to see all our offseason content, great draft stuff with those guys. I cover a lot of college football as well. That's my primary job here at Fansided. So I'll be getting into draft stuff as quickly as possible too. The offseason is plenty of fun, so be around for it. Subscribe to the show. Thank you for watching. Thanks for hanging out tonight. Thanks for interacting with the chat. I love interacting with the chat. It was a lot of fun to get your opinions and your frustrations into the show. Talk to you next Monday. Until then, have a good week and go Steelers.